She said all she wanted was personal space. I thought giving her freedom would fix everything, but instead I gave her something far more shocking: her own apartment. What started as a gesture of love and trust became the turning point that exposed secrets I never imagined I'd uncover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The night it all came crashing down is burned into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. I stood in the hallway of a modest building on the east side of Brighton, holding a spare set of keys in my palm. The weight of the tiny metal pieces felt heavier than my entire world. I had given those keys to my girlfriend Alina just a month earlier, never imagining I would one day use my copy to step into a reality I wasn't prepared for. As I slid the key into the lock, my heart raced in a way that wasn't excitement but dread. The apartment I had rented for her was supposed to be a sanctuary, a space where she could breathe without feeling suffocated by the closeness of our shared home. Yet, the muffled voices I heard on the other side of the door made it clear this place was harboring something else entirely, something I couldn't ignore any longer. The irony of it all stung the most. Just weeks earlier, she had sat across from me at our kitchen table, her dark eyes tired, her tone carefully measured. "I need space, Marcus," she had said, her voice soft but unyielding. I thought I understood. I thought I was being a supportive partner by listening and giving her exactly what she asked for. Who was I to cage someone I loved? We'd been together for nearly 3 years, and while we had our share of arguments, I never doubted her loyalty. When she told me she needed more freedom, I went above and beyond. Instead of pulling away, instead of resenting her request, I offered her what I believed was a compromise: her own place, just 10 minutes from mine. It felt like a grand gesture of trust, one that proved how much I valued her happiness. But standing outside that apartment, the faint echo of laughter trickling through the walls, I began to realize I had perhaps been the biggest fool in Brighton. It wasn't just laughter, it was male laughter, deep and comfortable, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a stranger passing through. My pulse quickened, and I pressed my ear closer to the door. The fragments of conversation made my stomach twist. There was no mistaking the intimacy in their tone, the ease that only came from familiarity. That was the moment everything changed, the moment I understood that the personal space I had so generously provided was nothing more than a stage for betrayal. I wish I could say I stormed inside, confronted them, and demanded answers right then and there, but instead, I froze. My hand trembled against the door frame, and I found myself swallowed by disbelief. My mind scrambled, trying to rewrite the narrative, searching desperately for explanations that might soften the blow. Maybe it was just a friend. Maybe she had company over because she felt lonely. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew. I had known from the moment she had asked for space that something in our relationship had shifted, and I had ignored those instincts in favor of blind faith. I pulled away from the door that night without knocking. I walked back to my car, keys still biting into my palm, and sat behind the wheel in complete silence. The city around me buzzed with its usual weekend noise. Bars spilling over with laughter, taxis honking, late-night diners flashing neon signs. But I felt as though I had stepped into another world. My body was present, but my spirit was cracked. That drive home was the longest 10 minutes of my life, every streetlight stretching into eternity as I replayed her words, her smiles, her excuses, over and over again in my head. When I finally walked into my own apartment, the silence greeted me like a cruel reminder of everything I thought I had built. Our framed photos still hung by the entryway, showing us at Lake Willoughby last summer, arms around each other, grins so wide they seemed unbreakable. I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, the question pounding in my skull: how could something that looked so solid crumble so quickly? The truth was, this wasn't the beginning of my story with Alina. It was the breaking point. Yet for you to understand how I ended up standing outside that apartment door, listening to another man's laughter echo from the place I had secured for her, you need to know where it all started. Because when you peel back the layers of betrayal, it's not just about the lies told in the shadows, but about the choices we make in the light that lead us there. And my choice, my greatest mistake, was believing that love meant giving without question, even when the signs were right in front of me. That night marked the first time I truly felt the ground beneath me give way, but it wasn't the last. What began as a simple request for personal space would unravel into a story of trust, manipulation, and the painful realization that sometimes, the more you give, the more someone is willing to take until there's nothing left. And so, with the keys still clutched in my hand, I stood at the threshold of truth, unaware that everything I thought I knew about Alina, about us, was about to be rewritten in ways I could never have imagined. Before everything fell apart, my life with Alina felt like the kind of story people envied from the outside. I wasn't wealthy, not by a long shot, but I worked steadily as a software consultant for a mid-sized firm in Brighton. My days followed a predictable rhythm. Coffee in the morning at the little corner cafe run by a retired couple who knew my order by heart, long hours spent solving problems for clients, and evenings often wrapped in the comfort of Alina's presence. I valued routine. Maybe too much. I liked knowing where my day began and ended, and I carried that same mindset into my relationships. To me, stability was love. To Alina, I would later realize, stability sometimes felt like confinement. Alina and I met 3 years earlier at a gallery opening downtown. She wasn't the type who blended into a crowd. Her laughter was sharp, like wind chimes on a stormy day, and her style was unapologetically bold. Scarlet scarves, vintage boots, eyeliner that made her eyes look sharper than knives. She was studying interior design at the time, juggling classes and part-time work at a boutique. I had gone to the gallery with a friend, more out of politeness than genuine interest. And yet when I saw her standing in front of an abstract painting, arms crossed and brow furrowed in a mix of concentration and disdain, I couldn't stop myself from walking over and making some clumsy comment about how the piece looked like a mess of spaghetti thrown at a wall. To my surprise, she laughed. That laugh hooked me instantly. In the months that followed, we moved from casual dates, late-night tacos, long walks along the pier, to a relationship that seemed to build momentum effortlessly. She admired my discipline, or at least she said she did. She'd tease me about my spreadsheets for budgeting or the way I color-coded my calendar, but she always followed it with a smile and a kiss. And I admired her spontaneity. Alina could turn a rainy afternoon into an adventure by dragging me out of the apartment to dance in the downpour, or try some hole-in-the-wall cafe that smelled more like burnt toast than actual coffee. Where I saw walls, she saw open fields. Where I saw boundaries, she saw possibility. It felt like balance. Our first year together was almost idyllic. We spent weekends exploring little towns outside Brighton, collecting memories in the form of Polaroids that she insisted on taping to the side of our fridge. Holidays were spent half with my family, half with hers. My parents adored her. My mother especially, who kept calling her refreshing, as if Alina's presence injected energy into every conversation. My father would joke that she could sell air if she put her mind to it. I took their approval as a sign that I had chosen well. But even in those early days, there were signs that we processed the world differently. Alina craved noise, movement, change. She wanted to travel constantly, to experience newness like oxygen. I, on the other hand, found comfort in repetition. I wanted to invest in long-term goals, save for a house, maybe even build toward marriage in the future. She often said, "We're young, Marcus, why plan so much?" And I would laugh it off, convincing myself that time would mellow her restlessness. That stability would eventually appeal to her as much as it did to me. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Living together had been her idea. About a year and a half into our relationship, she grew tired of the back and forth between apartments. I was hesitant at first. I liked my solitude, my tidy space, my quiet mornings, but she made it sound like the natural next step. So we signed a lease on a small but cozy apartment near the heart of Brighton. It had 2 bedrooms, though the second quickly became her makeshift studio, cluttered with fabric swatches, sketch pads, and mood boards pinned haphazardly across the wall. That was her world, and I respected it, even when it spilled over into the living room or left trails of glitter on the sofa cushions. Life under one roof was a mix of joy and compromise. We cooked together most nights, her experimenting with recipes, me cleaning up the disaster afterward. We argued over silly things, like her tendency to leave half-finished mugs of tea around the apartment, or my obsession with keeping the laundry folded the same day. But for the most part, we found rhythm. To anyone looking in, we were a couple building a future. Two people with different temperaments who balanced each other out. And to be honest, that's what I believed too. Yet, beneath the surface, there were moments that made me pause. Alina sometimes complained that the apartment felt too small, that she missed the freedom of her own space. She'd stay out late with classmates, claiming it was for project meetings, though I noticed her texts would sometimes trail off during those nights. When I asked, she brushed it off with a laugh, calling me Mr. Paranoid. I told myself it was normal. After all, relationships required trust, and I prided myself on not being controlling. Looking back, I think part of me always knew she was drifting. The signs were subtle then. Her sighs when I suggested a quiet evening instead of going out, the way she lingered on her phone with a faint smile when she thought I wasn't watching, the restless energy in her steps whenever we talked about the future. I convinced myself these were just quirks of her personality, things I could accept and live with because love, I believed, was about accepting the whole package. That was the Marcus of before, a man who thought love could conquer incompatibility, who believed that giving more would always bridge the gaps. I had no idea then that the very traits I admired in Alina, her spontaneity, her hunger for freedom, would be the same ones that tore us apart. Back then, in the glow of our shared laughter and late-night conversations, betrayal was the last thing on my mind. If someone had told me that the woman who asked me for space would use it as a shield to hide a double life, I would have laughed in disbelief. I trusted her more than I trusted my own instincts. And that trust, that blind certainty, was the foundation of the world I lived in before the cracks began to show. When I think back to how it all started, it feels almost surreal, like watching the first scenes of a movie where the audience already knows the ending but the characters remain blissfully unaware. I was 28 at the time, and though I wasn't lonely, I was at that point in life where casual dating felt like a carousel that never stopped spinning. I had met people here and there, through apps or friends of friends, but nothing seemed to stick. That's when Alina came crashing into my world, so unexpectedly, and so forcefully that I couldn't have resisted even if I'd wanted to. The night of the gallery opening where we first met was dreary, one of those cold Brighton evenings where the mist clung to the pavement like a blanket. I had gone reluctantly, persuaded by a colleague who insisted I needed more culture in my life. I didn't know much about art, but I knew enough to recognize that most of what hung on the walls didn't move me in the slightest. I was planning my escape within 15 minutes of arriving when I heard that laugh. The same laugh that would later make me feel both alive and destroyed. She was standing alone in front of a large canvas splattered with crimson and black paint, her arms folded across her chest, eyes narrowed in mock disdain. When I blurted out my clumsy spaghetti comment, I expected nothing more than an awkward silence. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed, the sound filling the otherwise pretentious hush of the gallery. People turned to look, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. But she didn't seem to care. That was the first thing that drew me to her. She didn't bend herself to fit into the room. She made the room bend to her. We ended up talking for nearly an hour that night, wandering from one painting to another, sharing ridiculous interpretations, and laughing at ourselves more than the art. By the time the gallery lights flickered as a signal for closing, I was hooked. She gave me her number with a playful smirk, as if daring me to call. I didn't wait long. The next evening, I sent her a message asking if she wanted to grab coffee. She countered with an invitation to join her for street food at a night market instead. That was Alina in a nutshell. Never the conventional choice, always steering towards something unpredictable. Our first few weeks of dating felt like a whirlwind. She had a way of pulling me into experiences I would never have chosen on my own. Midnight swims in the freezing ocean, late-night drives to nowhere with music blaring, spontaneous road trips without maps. For someone like me, who thrived on routine and planning, this was exhilarating. I felt alive in a way I hadn't before, as if she had unlocked a version of me that had been buried under layers of predictability. I mistook that adrenaline for love, convincing myself that this was what I had been missing all along. The early signs that should have made me cautious were easy to overlook back then. She was often late, sometimes by hours, to our dates, and when she arrived, she always had a dramatic story about why. A flat tire. A last-minute phone call. Getting lost because she wanted to take the scenic route. I laughed it off because her energy made up for it, but beneath the charm was a disregard for time and, perhaps, responsibility. There were also moments when her attention seemed split, when I'd be talking and she'd drift off into her own thoughts, eyes flicking to her phone like she was waiting for a message. At the time, I chalked it up to her busy schedule, her creative spirit, her hunger for constant stimulation. When she finally invited me into her apartment for the first time, it was exactly as I expected. Organized chaos. Books stacked haphazardly on the floor. Unfinished sketches taped to the walls. Candles burned down to nubs on every available surface. It smelled faintly of jasmine and paint thinner, a strange but intoxicating mix. That night, she cooked for me, if you could call it that. It was a stir-fry that ended up half charred, half raw, but she laughed so hard at the disaster that I couldn't help but join in. For me, it wasn't about the food. It was about the feeling of being let into her world, messy and imperfect but full of life. Looking back now, I see how quickly I became addicted to that energy. Alina made me feel like I was living on the edge of something extraordinary, as if life before her had been a muted sketch and she was the one splashing it with color. But what I didn't realize then was that color can blind you just as easily as it can brighten your world. The same qualities that dazzled me, her unpredictability, her disregard for rules, her insatiable need for freedom, were also the ones that would later erode the foundation of our relationship. I remember one evening in particular, maybe 2 months into dating, we were sitting on the hood of her car watching planes take off from the airport runway. She turned to me and asked, "Do you ever feel trapped, Marcus? Like the whole world is telling you to pick one path, settle down, and never look back?" I told her honestly that I didn't. That stability felt comforting to me, like a promise. She just shook her head and smiled, as though she already knew our answers would always be different. If I had paid attention to that moment, maybe I would have realized that we were wired in fundamentally opposite ways. But instead, I leaned in and kissed her, convinced that love was about bridging gaps, not recognizing when they're unbridgeable. In the beginning, all I saw was the brilliance of who she was, not the shadows lurking beneath. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of it all. The realization that the very things that pull us into love are sometimes the same things that drag us into heartbreak. There was a stretch of time, nearly a full year, when life with Alina felt like something out of a dream I didn't want to wake from. Those were the golden days, the period I still find myself returning to in memory when I question how everything spiraled so badly. If our relationship was a novel, this would have been the chapter that convinced the reader we were meant to last forever. And maybe that's what makes the betrayal so much sharper, the fact that once, for a brief while, everything truly did feel perfect. We had just moved into the apartment together, and despite my hesitations about sharing space, it didn't take long for the place to feel like a home. Alina brought a warmth to those bare walls that I never could have managed on my own. Within weeks, she had transformed the small, ordinary rooms into something alive. The second bedroom became her creative studio, but it spilled into the rest of the apartment. Brightly patterned throw pillows on the sofa, twinkling string lights draped across the balcony, small plants perched on windowsills. She insisted on lighting candles every evening, their flickering glow giving even our takeout dinners the feeling of an occasion. For someone like me, who lived a life of muted tones and order, her chaos felt strangely comforting, as if she was teaching me how to breathe in color. Our weekends together during that time were the highlight of my life. Alina had a knack for turning the simplest outing into an adventure. A grocery run would morph into a cooking challenge where we picked random ingredients and invented dishes. A casual walk would become an impromptu photo session with her dragging me into alleys and side streets, laughing as she directed me like some reluctant model. She found beauty in everything, and for a while she made me see it too. I remember one particular Saturday that stands out even now. We had decided to take a short trip out of the city to a lakeside town called Brighton. It was one of those late spring days when the air felt warm but not heavy, the sky impossibly blue. We rented a tiny cabin with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, the kind of place most people would overlook. But Alina loved it instantly, declaring it perfectly imperfect. We spent the afternoon on the water in a rented canoe, her laughter ringing out every time the boat wobbled dangerously under her movements. That night we built a fire outside, roasted marshmallows, and lay on our backs watching the stars. She rested her head on my chest and whispered, "This is what life should feel like." In that moment, I believed her. I thought we had captured something rare, something worth holding on to forever. Holidays were another realm where Alina shined. Christmas with her was an event, even if it was just the two of us. She would cover the apartment in lights, insisting that every corner needed a little sparkle. One year, she baked cookies shaped like snowflakes, though half of them broke apart because she refused to follow the recipe exactly. We laughed until tears streamed down our faces as we tried to salvage them with frosting. On New Year's Eve, instead of going to crowded parties, she suggested we write letters to our future selves and seal them in envelopes. We exchanged them with a promise to open them 5 years later. I still have mine tucked away in a drawer, unopened, a cruel relic of promises that were never meant to last. There were quieter joys too, moments that seemed so ordinary at the time but now feel precious. Sunday mornings spent in bed, tangled in blankets, with her reading aloud passages from whatever book she was obsessed with while I tried to pretend I wasn't dozing off. Evenings when we cooked together, the radio humming in the background, and she'd pull me into a dance across the kitchen tiles, flour dusting our clothes. Nights when she'd sketch by the window, lost in her own world, and I'd sit beside her with my laptop, each of us absorbed in our work but connected by the simple act of being near each other. During those good times, I never questioned her need for freedom. If she wanted to spend a night out with friends or take a weekend trip without me, I encouraged it. I told myself that love wasn't about possession, that trust meant allowing space. And she always returned with stories, wild tales of nights out, strange encounters, spontaneous detours, that left me both amused and in awe. It never occurred to me then that those same stories might not always be the whole truth. When I think about why I stayed as long as I did, why I gave so much of myself even when doubts began to creep in, it's because of those golden days. They built the foundation of everything I believed about us. They were proof, in my mind, that we had something extraordinary, something worth fighting for. Even when cracks began to show later, I kept looking back at those times like a lighthouse, convincing myself that if we had once been that happy, we could be again. That was the trap, really, the memory of happiness. Because when you've experienced love at its brightest, it's hard to accept when it dims. You cling to the light, blind to the shadows growing around you. That's what the good times were for me, a blinding light that made it impossible to see the darkness creeping in. Looking back now, the first warning signs weren't dramatic or obvious. They weren't explosions of anger or cruel betrayals. They were quiet, almost forgettable moments that slid past me because I was too wrapped up in the glow of what we had built together. But the truth is, those moments were the cracks forming beneath the surface, small fractures in the foundation that would eventually spread and tear everything apart. The first thing I noticed was how her need for space started to expand in ways I hadn't expected. When we first moved in together, Alina would occasionally retreat to her art studio for hours, sketching or painting with the door closed. I didn't mind. It was part of who she was. But gradually, her desire for solitude bled beyond that room. She started spending whole evenings away from home, not with friends, but alone. She would text me something vague like, "I just need to clear my head," and disappear until midnight. At first, I told myself it was fine. Everyone needs time to breathe, but a small knot of unease began to grow in my stomach. Then there were the silences. Alina had once been a river of words, constantly filling the room with her observations, jokes, and endless curiosity. She could make a story out of anything, and I loved listening to her. But I started to notice that sometimes, when I asked about her day, she would shrug and give a clipped answer, "It was fine," or she'd change the subject. I dismissed it as stress, as exhaustion, but the silences stretched longer and longer, and the girl who had once filled every corner of our lives with color started leaving whole sections blank. It was during one of our usual Sunday mornings that I really felt it. We were lying in bed, the sunlight cutting through the blinds, and I reached for her hand. She pulled it back casually, not harshly, but in a way that made me feel like a stranger. She rolled onto her side, away from me, and when I asked if something was wrong, she just mumbled, "I'm tired." That was it. No explanation, no attempt to bridge the gap. Just distance. It was small, maybe even insignificant on its own. But in that moment, I felt the first pang of doubt, like the warmth I had once taken for granted was cooling. Another warning came with her growing irritability. Alina had always been spirited, passionate, sometimes even stubborn, but she rarely directed her sharpness at me. Yet, slowly, little disagreements started sparking into something more. If I suggested a restaurant, she'd roll her eyes and say, "You always pick the boring places." If I forgot to do the laundry, she'd sigh in a way that felt heavier than the mistake deserved. Once, when I teased her gently about spending too much money on candles, she snapped. "At least I care about making this place feel alive. You'd probably live in a cardboard box if it were up to you." She laughed afterward, brushing it off as a joke, but the sting lingered. The biggest red flag, though, was how her stories began to change. Alina had always been an open book, relaying every detail of her nights out or adventures with friends. But over time, her tales grew vaguer, the details fuzzier. She'd come home late and say something like, "Oh, we just grabbed drinks, nothing exciting," and leave it at that. When I asked who she was with, she'd sometimes pause a beat too long before answering. It wasn't enough to accuse her of lying, but it was enough to plant seeds of suspicion. And those seeds, once planted, have a way of growing wild in the mind. There was one evening that still haunts me because of how ordinary it seemed at first. We had planned a quiet dinner together. Something simple. I cooked pasta, set the table, even lit the candles she loved so much. But when Alina walked in, hours late, she barely glanced at the effort. She looked drained, distracted, and when I asked where she'd been, she waved me off with, "Don't start, Marcus. I told you I needed some time to myself." Her tone was sharp, final, and for the first time I felt like I was intruding in her life instead of being a part of it. I tried to rationalize everything, to convince myself that relationships had phases, that her moods and silences were temporary. I reminded myself of the good times, the laughter, the starlit nights. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. I began to notice her phone never left her side anymore, how she angled the screen away when messages popped up. I noticed how she spent more time looking out the window than looking at me. I noticed the way her laughter sounded different, less like joy, more like deflection. But perhaps the most telling warning sign wasn't what Alina did, but what I did. I stopped asking questions. I stopped pushing for answers when she brushed me off. I told myself I didn't want to be controlling, that love meant trust. But really, I was afraid of what I might hear if I pressed too hard. It was easier to accept half answers than to confront the possibility that the woman I loved was already slipping away. The warning signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs. I saw them, I felt them. But I convinced myself they were just passing storms, not the heralds of something darker. I wanted so desperately to believe in the version of us that existed during the golden days that I ignored the truth unfolding right in front of me. And that denial, the choice to look away, was the most dangerous warning sign of all. The problems that began as whispers soon grew into full conversations, then into shouts that echoed through the walls of our apartment. If the first warning signs were cracks, what came next was the collapse of the structure I had built in my head about us. It didn't happen overnight. It happened the way erosion eats away at stone, bit by bit, until one day the foundation is gone and you're left standing on rubble. Alina's absences became more frequent, and the explanations grew thinner. What had once been a casual, "I'm grabbing drinks with a friend," became, "Don't wait up for me." I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and realize she wasn't home yet. Sometimes she'd slip in just before dawn, claiming she'd fallen asleep on a friend's couch. Other times, she'd come home smelling faintly of smoke and perfume that wasn't hers. When I asked questions, she'd brush me off with irritation, as though I were the one crossing a line. "You know I need space," she'd say, her voice sharp. "Why are you trying to cage me in?" The words stung because I had never thought of myself as controlling, yet suddenly, in her eyes, that's exactly who I was becoming. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Conversations turned into battlegrounds. I remember one evening when I suggested we spend a weekend together, just the two of us, like we used to. I thought it would rekindle something, remind her of the good times. Instead, she slammed her fork down on the table and snapped, "Why do you always need so much from me? Can't you just let me breathe?" I sat there stunned, staring at the pasta I'd cooked, realizing that what I'd offered as a gesture of love had been interpreted as suffocation. The fights began to escalate from there. Small disagreements over household chores or weekend plans would spiral into screaming matches. Alina had a way of twisting my words until I felt like the villain. If I expressed concern about her late nights, she accused me of being paranoid. If I asked for more time together, she accused me of being needy. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I really was the problem. Maybe I was too demanding, too sensitive, too desperate for closeness. That self-doubt was like poison, seeping into every corner of my thoughts. Then there was the night that marked a turning point. Alina came home late, well past midnight, and I finally confronted her. I asked, directly, where she had been. Instead of answering, she laughed. This cold, dismissive laugh that didn't sound like her at all. "Why do you care so much?" she said. "It's not like you own me." Something about those words, the casual cruelty in them, cut deeper than any of our previous arguments. For the first time, I realized she didn't just want space. She wanted a life that didn't include me in it. The tension began seeping into the little things. Meals became silent. The bed felt colder, the space between us widening with every night we lay there facing opposite directions. She stopped reaching for my hand. She stopped asking about my day. Even her laughter, once the soundtrack of our life, grew rare, replaced by sighs and sharp tones. Our apartment, once warm and alive, began to feel like a cage for me and an inconvenience for her. There were moments when I tried to fight for us, to reignite the flame. I booked tickets to an art exhibit I knew she'd been wanting to see. She canceled last minute, claiming she was too tired. I planned a dinner at her favorite restaurant. She spent the entire evening scrolling through her phone, barely looking at me. I even suggested couples counseling, though the words tasted foreign in my mouth. She laughed outright at that, shaking her head as if I had made the most ridiculous suggestion. "We don't need therapy, Marcus. You just need to stop overthinking everything." But I couldn't stop overthinking, because the evidence was there, piling up in small but undeniable ways. The secrecy with her phone, the late nights, the irritability, the disinterest. And though she never admitted it outright, I began to suspect there was someone else. The thought lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she turned away to answer a message, I felt the sting. But when I tried to ask her directly, she'd explode, accusing me of not trusting her. It became a vicious cycle. My doubt fueled her anger fueled my doubt. I found myself withdrawing too. I stopped sharing things with her, stopped trying to connect. It felt pointless, like speaking into a void. The silence between us became heavier than the arguments, an oppressive weight that pressed down on me every time I walked through the door. Even my own apartment no longer felt like mine. It felt like neutral territory, a battlefield where neither of us was winning. The worst part was the loneliness. To live with someone, to share a home and a bed, yet feel utterly alone. That's a kind of ache I wouldn't wish on anyone. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we had gone from starlit canoe rides and whispered promises to this cold distance. I would tell myself that relationships had ups and downs, that maybe this was just a rough patch. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a rough patch. This was the unraveling. And though I couldn't admit it yet, I could feel the inevitable drawing closer, the moment when I'd be forced to choose between clinging to what was left or letting it go entirely. When you're living inside a storm, it's hard to tell how bad it really is. The winds feel normal. Because you've been standing in them so long, the rain feels tolerable because it comes down one drop at a time. I told myself that the tension with Alina was just a rough patch, that every couple went through phases like this. But part of me was desperate for someone else to confirm it, to tell me I wasn't imagining the distance, the hostility, the slow erosion of everything we once were. That need for outside perspective is what finally drove me to open up to the people I had been keeping in the dark. The first person I confided in was my sister, Claire. She lived a few towns over and had always been my anchor, the one who called me out when I was being foolish, the one who reminded me of who I was when I forgot. I hadn't told her much about the problems with Alina, mostly because I was embarrassed. I didn't want to admit that the relationship I had bragged about, the one I had defended so fiercely, was crumbling. But one Saturday morning, after another night of Alina coming home long past midnight and slipping wordlessly into bed, I called Claire. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our places, and the moment she saw me, she knew something was wrong. "You look exhausted," she said, frowning as she sat down across from me. I laughed bitterly and admitted, "I feel exhausted, not just tired, drained." That was all it took for the dam to break. I told her everything. The late nights, the dismissiveness, the fights that spun out of nothing. I even admitted my suspicion that Alina might be seeing someone else. Claire listened without interrupting, her brow furrowed, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. When I finally stopped talking, she let out a long sigh. "Marcus, you know this isn't normal, right? A partner doesn't make you feel like this. Love isn't supposed to feel like you're begging for scraps." Her words hit me hard, because deep down I already knew them to be true. Hearing them out loud, though, was different. It was like someone had turned on a light in a dark room I'd been stumbling through. Later that week, I opened up to my coworker, Jonah. We weren't especially close, but he had a way of being straightforward, and I craved honesty. We were working late on a project when he noticed me staring blankly at my screen. "You okay, man?" he asked. I hesitated, then muttered, "Not really. Things at home are rough." Jonah didn't pry, but he listened as I shared a pared-down version of what was happening. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something I'll never forget. "Look, I don't know her, but I do know this. If someone wants to be with you, you'll know it. If they don't, you'll be confused all the time." That simple statement echoed in my head for days. I had been living in confusion for months, constantly questioning myself, my actions, my worth. And Jonah's words crystallized what Claire had already told me. This wasn't about me being too much or not enough. This was about Alina pulling away, and me refusing to see it. Even my parents, who had met Alina only a handful of times, sensed something was wrong. During a Sunday phone call, my mother asked casually how things were going. I hesitated too long before answering, and she caught it immediately. "Marcus, are you happy?" she asked gently. The question pierced me because it was so simple, yet I didn't have an answer. I deflected, muttering something about work stress. But after I hung up, her question lingered like a shadow. Was I happy? The truth was no. I hadn't been happy in a long time. These conversations didn't fix anything, but they shifted something inside me. For months, I had been gaslighting myself, convincing myself that the problems were minor, that I was overreacting, that love was supposed to be this hard. But when I heard the voices of the people I trusted, Claire's firm honesty, Jonah's blunt wisdom, my mother's quiet concern, it cut through the fog. They weren't telling me anything I didn't already know. They were simply validating the truths I had been too afraid to face. One evening, after another fight with Alina over something trivial, I sat on the balcony alone, the city lights blurring through my tired eyes. I thought about what Claire had said, that love shouldn't feel like begging. I thought about Jonah's reminder that real love doesn't leave you confused. I thought about my mother's question, so direct, so impossible to dodge. For the first time, I admitted to myself that the relationship wasn't just struggling, it was breaking. And maybe it was already broken. But even then, even with all that validation, I wasn't ready to let go. I clung to the memories of the good times, to the promises whispered under starlit skies. I told myself that if I just tried harder, if I just gave her more space, more patience, more understanding, things might return to how they once were. It was a lie I wanted to believe. Still, those conversations planted a seed in me, a seed of clarity, of strength. Because once you've heard the truth spoken by people who love you, it becomes harder to ignore. The storm might still rage, but suddenly, you realize you don't have to stand in it forever. There comes a moment in every failing relationship when denial no longer works, when even the strongest memories of happier days can't shield you from the reality staring you in the face. For me, that moment came on a damp Thursday night in early November, though in truth, I had been circling the edge of it for weeks. The warning signs, the fights, the silences, they had already drained me, but what happened that night stripped away the last of my illusions. Alina had told me she'd be working late. I didn't question it at first. She had said the same thing many times before. But something in her voice that day felt different, like she was rushing to end the conversation. The seed of doubt that had been growing in me all these months sprouted again, gnawing at my thoughts as I tried to focus on dinner. Hours passed. 9 o'clock came, then 10, then 11. The apartment was silent except for the sound of my clock ticking, each minute making the walls feel tighter, the air heavier. I told myself not to check her location, not to go down that paranoid path. But eventually, my resolve cracked. I opened the app we'd once shared casually, back when trust wasn't a question, and there it was, her little blue dot, nowhere near her office. Instead, it was planted in a residential neighborhood across town. My heart slammed in my chest as I stared at it, willing it to move, to shift back to the story she had told me. But it didn't. It stayed there, and with that stillness my world tilted. When Alina finally came home well past midnight, she looked startled to see me still awake. She tossed her bag onto the couch and said casually, "I told you I'd be late." My voice trembled as I asked her where she had been. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before she shrugged. "I went out for drinks after work. I needed to blow off steam." The lie was so thin, so careless, that I felt something inside me break. I pressed her again, and that's when she snapped. Her words came like knives. "Marcus, I can't breathe in this relationship. You're suffocating me with your questions, your constant need for reassurance. I told you I need space, and you just don't get it. Maybe I'd rather be anywhere else than here with you." That was it. Not just the implication, not just the anger, but the truth buried in her outburst. She'd rather be anywhere else. And for the first time, she wasn't just saying she needed space. She was saying she didn't want me in her space at all. I sat there, numb, as she stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door. I didn't follow her. I didn't try to argue or beg. I just sat in the living room, staring at the flickering shadows of the streetlight outside. My chest felt hollow, as if every ounce of hope had been scooped out, leaving only an emptiness I couldn't fill. The next morning, I went through the motions of life as though I were on autopilot. I brewed coffee, ironed my shirt, went to work. But inside, I was shattered. Even my colleagues noticed. Jonah pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? That the woman I had once believed was my forever had just told me she'd rather be anywhere else but with me? That weekend, I reached the lowest point. Alina barely spoke to me, spending most of her time in her studio with the door closed or vanishing for hours without explanation. I wandered the apartment like a ghost, unable to focus on anything, unable to eat, unable to sleep. I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Eyes sunken, shoulders slumped. A man who had lost not just his partner, but his sense of self. On Sunday night, I found myself sitting on the balcony again, clutching one of those letters we had written to our future selves on New Year's Eve. I had never opened mine. My hands trembled as I tore the envelope and unfolded the paper. In my own handwriting, I had written, "Marcus, I hope you're still with Alina. I hope you're building the life you dreamed of together. Don't forget how lucky you are." I laughed bitterly through tears as I read those words, mocking the naive man who had written them. Lucky. That man had no idea. That man couldn't have imagined sitting here alone, feeling like a stranger in his own home. But reading that letter was the final push I needed. It forced me to confront the truth I had been running from. The Alina I had fallen in love with didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never had, not in the way I believed. Rock bottom isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a quiet moment of clarity, a realization that the life you're living no longer resembles the one you wanted. That night, I finally understood that no amount of patience, no amount of sacrifice was going to fix what was broken. I couldn't keep pouring myself into a void, hoping it would eventually echo back. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered the words out loud for the first time. "It's over." The sound startled me as if speaking it gave it power, but in that moment, I felt something shift. The weight didn't disappear, but it began to lift, just enough for me to breathe again. I had reached the bottom, and in doing so, I had found the only way forward. The morning after I whispered the truth to myself, I woke with a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something close, like the fog that had suffocated me for months had finally begun to thin. The apartment was still silent, Alina still distant, but inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't clinging to maybes. I knew what I had to do. For years, I had built my life around her, my routines, my choices, my compromises. But in that moment, I understood that continuing down this path meant erasing myself completely. She had asked for space, demanded it, resented me for not giving enough of it. Fine, I would give her more than space. I would give her freedom, total and absolute, and in doing so I would free myself. I started by making a list. It was something small, almost mechanical, but it helped me channel my emotions into action. On one side, I wrote what I needed to take with me: clothes, documents, the books that had carried me through late nights, my guitar gathering dust in the corner. On the other side, I wrote what I would leave behind, not just the furniture or the gifts, but the weight of trying to fix something unfixable. That weekend, while Alina was out, I began packing. Each folded shirt, each item tucked into a box, felt like a step toward reclaiming myself. At first my hands shook and I kept pausing to stare around the apartment, remembering the laughter we once shared in these rooms. But as the hours passed, the sadness dulled into determination. This place had become a shell, a reminder of promises broken. It was time to let it go. When she returned that evening, she found me sitting on the couch with 2 suitcases by my feet. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of surprise that wasn't tinged with contempt. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she probably intended. I met her gaze and spoke calmly, though my heart raced. "I'm giving you what you wanted. Space. Not just in words, but in reality. I can't keep living like this, Alina. We've both been unhappy, and I think we've known for a long time that this isn't working." She stood frozen in the doorway, processing my words. Then, almost offensively, she scoffed. "So you're just leaving? After everything?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Because after everything, I've realized that staying is the cruelest thing we can do to each other. We're not the same people we used to be, and pretending otherwise has only been hurting us both." There was no dramatic fight, no pleading or tears. She turned away, muttering something under her breath, and disappeared into the bedroom. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. For once, the silence between us wasn't suffocating, it was liberating. I left that night and checked into a modest furnished apartment I had found online just days before. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, plain walls, the faint smell of fresh paint. But when I dropped my bags on the floor, I felt lighter than I had in months. This was mine, my space. A place untouched by resentment or bitterness. The first few nights were strange. I'd wake in the middle of the night expecting to hear her moving around, or I'd cook dinner and instinctively make enough for 2. Loneliness sat heavy at times, but it was different from the loneliness I'd felt with her. This was honest loneliness, the kind that comes with healing, not the kind born of rejection and neglect. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted away from, ashamed to admit how consumed I'd been by the chaos of my relationship. I picked up my guitar again, letting the music fill the quiet spaces in my apartment. I started running in the mornings, feeling my body grow stronger with each mile. With every small step, I was stitching myself back together. Jonah came by one Saturday with takeout and a 6-pack, grinning as he stepped into my new place. "Man, this suits you," he said, glancing around. "It's like you can finally breathe again." He was right. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't choking on what-ifs or walking on eggshells. I could sit in my own space and feel peace. Weeks turned into months, and though the scars remained, they no longer defined me. Alina reached out once, a short message asking if I was doing okay. I stared at it for a long time before replying simply, "I'm doing better." It wasn't a lie. I didn't hate her, but I no longer loved her either. What we'd shared was real once, but it had run its course. And letting it go had given me back the one thing I had lost most of all: myself. Standing on my balcony one crisp evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I thought back to the man I had been just a few months earlier, broken, desperate, clinging to a relationship that had already slipped away. That man would barely recognize me now. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and I had finally learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who demands space is to step aside completely. In the end, it wasn't just Alina who got the freedom she craved. I did too. And that freedom became the foundation for a life where I could finally breathe, grow, and move forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.